Well, hold on. Are moving 2 million people out versus killing 2 million people are very different things, right? Not desirable in either place. I don't think Israel wants to have to move. The reality is the world is a tough place. And what is the better solution to get rid of Hamas? If the Mexican cartels who ravage Mexico, if they came across the border, well, there's kind of an irony here in that they kill 100,000 Americans a year with fentanyl, but that's a silent death. But if is there a terrorist attack across the border in Texas and a bunch of different places, and there were 1,300 dead Americans.
Yeah, and if they were dedicated to the elimination of Americans and the taking back American land,
right? What would happen?
We would do whatever it took.
I think the average American lives in this kind of post-Cold War, nothing actually affects us. Everything can just kind of be Twitter fingers. And the reality is there are places in the world where Twitter fingers turn to trigger fingers to, Drake. I still think it's it's a cheeky line, but it really, it's like, no, there are places in the world where like history has not ended. What's crazy about Israel, because it's so tied into tech, is we know people who are getting called up into the military. Imagine just like in the US being called up as a reserve because we now need to go invade Mexico and remove the narco cartels, right? Like it is unfathomable. Where in the world are you?
I'm in Puerto Rico at our buddy Jonathan's house, the same place where we found out a year ago that SBF had committed massive fraud, and that I was immediately asking, oh, what's his next move? And you said, there is no next move. He's going to jail. Like as soon as the CZ thing happened or whatever, the first, thing that happened, you knew it was happening.
Yeah, I don't know. I've been around some crypto grifters before, and they always end up in jail.
Yeah.
Your internet okay? Like, I guess you're in a developing part of the world, right?
Yeah.
But people would definitely want to turn it into the 51st state as long as it would reliably vote Democrat.
Yeah. Yes, exactly. Stereotypically, I was having Wi-Fi.
Actually, it is really sad at how much devastation that still exists from Maria. Like all things considered, like the really brutal hurricane. And I was actually talking to someone from Puerto Rico recently, and he said the island really has never recovered. And frankly, the tax policy that I think a lot of people we know take advantage of, I don't think it's had necessarily the economic impact that maybe the island was hoping for. Although I wouldn't really give the local politicians much credit in Puerto Rico. It seems like they're somewhat corrupt. So I think it's a bidirectional problem here. But it is interesting that the U.S. basically has, like, if you think about Puerto Rico, it is effectively a state that doesn't have the same rights as a state, although there are some people in Puerto Rico who actually want it to be an independent country. But if you live in Puerto Rico, you can move to New York. So it's like a pretty nice deal for if you're someone who wants to leave Puerto Rico and get into the U.S., like talking about immigration like were before. But I think in terms of just like the infrastructure and kind of this weird stepchild of the Spanish-American War, right? Like if you think of all the colonies that the U.S. or kind of like territory the U.S. was in charge of or kind of a heavy influence over, Cuba, Philippines, after the Spanish-American War, we kept Puerto Rico. And that's kind of never been a resolved issue.
Yeah. And maybe it's a segue to Israel. Would we say that Puerto Rico is an apartheid situation of the U.S.? I don't know, I'm just joking.
No. I mean, but that's the crazy thing is that there are crazies on the internet who have come out this week, despite what should be kind of a relatively easy thing to condemn, in the sense that it's so horrific and so inhumane that even if you're a supporter of Palestinian independence or Palestinian right to kind of self-determination, I think a normal person can look at the situation and say, Hamas is evil, and I condemn like 100% all acts of brutality against innocent civilians. And instead, I think what we got was a very clear example of people start with, I have a mood affiliation towards something. Israel is bad. So therefore, I'm going to backfill my take on the situation, not from the first principles of was this a terrible atrocity committed against innocent people, and not even just people, like old people, babies. You have live hostages. Terrible, terrible stuff, right? It makes me sick to my stomach thinking about it, especially the stuff with the babies, because now I'm a parent, and just to think of, I saw a video of people's kids are being used in social media posts by Hamas, and to see the baby crying, like my stomach, I couldn't like eat after that. It's just so sickening to think that this kind of stuff is happening. Barbaric, right? Like not civilization. This is barbarism, and you have these progressive crazies in the United States doing mental gymnastic contortions. Oh, well, it wasn't 40 babies beheaded. It was only a few babies. Like, it's just like, come on, like you've completely lost the plot. And I want to almost step back because I feel like we're diving into the thing that really is boiling my blood as it relates to domestic U.S. politics. And if only our other co-host would show up, he would immediately say, another foreign instance where everything runs through the American lens of domestic politics and political neuroses. But the BLM social media post from Chicago, where they were showing the paragliding terrorist with a Palestinian flag, it's so infuriating that it's showing true colors, and you're gonna immediately have apologists be like, oh well, that's just like this one. The post stayed up for a day,
and they
and
trickled
only
down.
after a day of maybe getting enough, then they removed it, and they kind of put this cheeky like apology that was kind of a non-apology.
But they did a third one.
What?
They did a third one that was like, we've been Palestinian supporters from the beginning. You should have just you should have listened to us when we said it. Like, we support Palestine.
Right. But so supporting Palestine is different than
Exactly.
like wholeheartedly condemning the atrocity that was committed against innocent civilians by Hamas. And this is where it's like, and I got some pushback. It was interesting. Like I kind of put a few tweets out on Twitter. Look, I'm not Jewish. I'm very pro Israel. I have a lot of Israeli kind of like friends and Jewish friends. I don't have as many Palestinian friends. Like I only know a couple of people. So let me kind of like preface it there. But I thought it was completely appropriate after what is the equivalent of an Israeli 9/11, right? Like this devastating attack on innocent civilians, right? To show some support for Israel, right? Like I never did a Ukraine flag, but I did an Israeli flag. So that maybe speaks something about me. But what was interesting is the thing that I started pointing out is this both sidesism coverage. And it's funny, I actually had a similar tweet to what Alad Gil's tweet about the front page of the New York Times on Sunday. And we talked a lot about this of just, I went to the New York Times and I was like, okay, well, at least the New York Times is going to have to cover this as like this terrible terrorist attack and atrocity. And the front page had a total count of dead people across Israel, which, by the way, was way undercounted at that point because we were in the kind of fog of war on the numbers. I think at this point it's 1,300 Israeli civilians, or it might be even more now if you count the military and then obviously the hostages. But there was like 900 dead in kind of like the Middle East, basically. And then the photo on the front page, the first thing that would load was a building of rubble in Gaza, not the 260 people killed at a concert for peace, the 40 dead babies, or the burn baby, like none of that, right? So it just like, and I want to be clear, I understand that a journalist is not responsible for the front page. Like, the person reporting doesn't get to decide what the front page is, doesn't get to decide the headlines and how things are laid out. But I think whoever is in charge, the editorial staff, the senior staff, that's just completely not appropriate the day after this terrible atrocity is happening, because it's trying to equate a kind of set of military actions that happened by Israel the next day against Hamas, which we can get into the details. When Israel bombs a building, they knock on the building before. So they drop a munition that basically indicates that the building is now going to be bombed. And then they give a period of time for people to clear out, which what ends up happening is you have the terrorists get out immediately. And then if there are anybody left, that would obviously be a tragedy in its own right. But it's, there is no version of the Israelis showing up and killing 260 people at a peace-loving concert, right? When Israel is doing a strike, they're doing a strike against a terrorist, and they're trying to minimize collateral damage. But anyways, going back to this New York Times thing, Alad's post I think got a lot more play. I think he was a little bit more explicit. I was kind of saying both sidesism because I was almost like a little afraid to kind of like dip too much in, given that I am not Israeli or Jewish. And Alad just kind of went for it, and it went totally viral. I think like basically everyone commented on it. But what was really interesting is you had a lot of what I would consider more moderate, centrist type Silicon Valley VC types, like Mark Pincus responded. Like basically a bunch of Jewish people said, I'm canceling my New York Times subscription as a result of this. And what was interesting is I got some pushback. Some people sent me DMs like, what do you mean by this? Like the both sidesism. And I just kind of didn't engage because I was like, okay, I have nothing to win here. I'm not going to delete the tweet because I want to stand by it. But I'm just like, I'm not going to get into fights over an issue that frankly, I don't have any skin in the game on. But was kind of very telling is the reaction. And then what happened on Monday or Tuesday, and I think you tweeted this, is the Times coverage started to shift in terms of what was on the front page. So the front page, I think on either Monday, and I'm talking about the online. I don't actually even know what print was, but the online Monday or Tuesday was dead Israelis, very graphic images. Like this obviously was a terrorist attack. And so my heart breaks for anyone affected by this in Israel. If you lost someone directly, obviously it's just unimaginable. But anyone you might know, or obviously all the people who are pulled up as reservists, and yes, I also feel bad for the 2 million people in Gaza who are caught in a crossfire with this genocidal terrorist organization that is in charge. But like, there's an appropriate way to kind of indicate that. And I think we've seen a range of statements. There was a lot of criticism. For example, Barack Obama was a little late to getting a statement out. But when his statement came out, like I was expecting something worse. And instead he was able to actually say, in I think a very straightforward way, Hamas terrorist organization attack, with giving the appropriate amount of space, I think, for what's happened in Israel, while also indicating that there are going to be a bunch of innocent civilians in Gaza who die as a result of this war, right? And so I think that there were appropriate ways to do that in a way that you can indicate that there's still some hey, I think we should be trying to kind of work to a peaceful solution with the Palestinians. But I think that there's a whole other group, and this is the progressive wing, which you're quickly realizing like Barack Obama is not a progressive, right? Like he is of the old guard, maybe a little bit more progressive than a Biden, although at this point Biden, kind of the inmates are running the asylum, given that I don't think Biden is really driving. Although Biden's speech, probably the best. I haven't watched that many speeches of his presidency because most of the time he barely can talk, but it was a good speech. And it was unequivocal in its support for Israel because Israel is a U.S. ally. And I mean, we're putting skin in the game. We're putting multiple carrier groups and things like that. So maybe we should just talk about it because I think we spent some time in the chat groups talking about like what's at the root of it and is this the current thing, or like what is actually the current thing here, right? Like Ukraine was a very clear current thing. It's just like you're a good cathedral, you support Ukraine, put the Ukraine flag in your bio. But right now, what is actually the current thing? Like how do I actually, if I want to just be like a good PMCer, want to keep my job at BCG or McKinsey, like what am I supposed to do? And so maybe we should give a guide for those people, given that we've probably spent too much time analyzing this.
Well, this one's the first tough current thing in the sense that it's unclear what to do, or that there's a great schism in the current thing. If you think of the current things over the last 5 years, it's been Me Too, BLM, Ukraine, maybe Stop Asian Hate a little bit, COVID. And usually it was pretty clear what to do. The progressives and the liberals were aligned, more or less. And so it was clear that you stood with Ukraine. It was clear that you stood with BLM, clear that you believed women. And if you didn't do those things, you might get fired. And this is the first current thing where there's a schism, there's an intra-civil war among the left. There are more progressive side who are more sympathetic with the Palestinian cause. And yet there's a lot of people who stand with Israel. And so you see this playing out in Harvard, you see this playing out in New York Times. And it just so happens that Israel, I think, was the key wedge issue all along that was going to divide the left because it breaks the brains. It breaks the script, right? Usually the script is oppressed group gets oppressed by an oppressor who commits some sort of violence, and it's clear who's the bad guy and who's the good guy, right? Ukraine, Russia invades Ukraine. We need to stand with Ukraine to fight the oppressor, more powerful Russia. Yeah, there were some Putin sympathizers, but they were fringe on the right, and they were kind of cast aside. And basically everyone supported. Some people said, "Hey, we shouldn't send troops to Ukraine," but even they admitted that Russia was the aggressor and the bad guy. Israel-Palestine is a very complicated situation. It's not the same situation where a more powerful country oppresses a less powerful country or group of people, and the less powerful is the more moral. That's not the case here.
Well, I mean, Israel is the more powerful country, so that is actually the frame in which
Israel is more powerful, but they're also more moral.
Oh, I think if you were to talk to the progressive left, they would not say that. They would say this is an apartheid state, and this is no different than South Africa.
But the moderate person would not say that. The moderate person would agree with Sam Harris when he says the moral equivalence. Like if Palestine and Israel were reversed their power, Palestine would not be as charitable or merciful towards the Israeli second-class citizens. Their charter of their leadership is dedicated to eradicating Israel, eliminating Jews, right? And so you even talked about earlier, there's just a big difference in how Israel treats civilians with how Palestinian leadership treats civilians. So on this issue, some people want to align with the group that is in a worse position, and some look at the facts and say, or look at the situation and say, hey, the situation is different. And actually, I think Israel is the more moral actor here. They might want a two-state solution or whatever, but they say, hey, this might be intolerable. But then the third thing, also just worth noting, not to echo our friend Kanye West, who's not our friend, but there are a lot of Jews in tech, in New York Times, in academia, in media, and I had this tweet. It was a little glib, but I said people were willing to be targeted as men. They were willing to be targeted as white, but they're not willing to be targeted as Jews. Like, people aren't proud of their whiteness. They're not proud of their masculinity necessarily, but they are proud to be Jews. People they want Israel to exist. They want Israel to be safe. And also, it's worth noting that the situation here is where Israelis are literally scared of their lives. For BLM and all the other causes, people weren't, white people or men weren't scared for their lives. They were maybe scared of getting falsely accused or something. But this situation has radicalized a lot of people who said, hey, I supported BLM, but BLM doesn't support me if they're Jewish or on the Jewish cause. And so this is causing a big schism.
Yeah, look, I mean, I think it's just exposing the fraud of the progressive part of the party. Is they start with the thing that they think is, and then they work back to do gymnastics to support basically Hamas or kind of minimize Hamas's, freedom fighters or whatever BS. And you can say, oh, that's only the radical side, but the progressives are run by the radical people, right? Rashida Tlaib in Congress with the Palestinian flag, yet when asked about the atrocities, she's unwilling to condemn Hamas. She's shuffling away and having someone deal with it. So it just absolutely start with the kind of like position and then work your way back and then stick your head in the sand if you get caught in what is obviously should be a pretty straightforward thing to say. Even if you support the Palestinians, you should start with, on the day after the equivalent of Israeli 9/11, Hamas is evil. Hamas is a terrorist organization. This was an atrocity. State the facts. Just get that out. And then you can go try to have a discussion a few days later or a week later as this war starts to rage and you see all these terrible images, right? Use your freedom of speech and have some nuance. But the immediate rush to justify a terrorist act or minimize a terrorist act because it's now going to hurt your preconceived or original political opinion is crazy. And then obviously the inconsistencies in the logic. Believe women. Me too. Okay, Israelis, women saying that they're raped. Well, do we have proof? And it's like you have these journalists who are kind of like, gumshoe reporting. And it's like, okay, so when it's the right person saying that they were raped, if someone's saying Donald Trump sexually assaulted me or whatever, we got to believe them right away, right? Because Trump is bad, so therefore believe women. But when it's the Israeli woman going through this terrible atrocity, we rush to qualify, or maybe we should dig in a little bit deeper. So that's completely fraudulent to say believe women and then actually not follow through on it, right? And I think, like, oh, so the oppressed versus the oppressor. Is there a group of people in history who have been more oppressed than Jewish people? Right? Like, but, like, we should just say that, right? I'm not Jewish, so I can kinda say it. You don't have to be the one trying to claim it. Do we think that the Holocaust exists? I believe that the Holocaust exists. I think it's on par with one of the most, if not the most terrible tragedy in human existence, in the sense of the concentratedness against a single group of people, right? Yeah, Mao and Stalin killed probably more numbers, but I don't think the evilness of the Holocaust is rivaled, at least in kind of anything in the modern era at that scale, right? And so do Jewish people get a little bit of, like, yeah, maybe they've been oppressed, right? And there are plenty of other instances, right? Like Antonio would be quick to point out in Spain, or during the Inquisition, or Rome, or the English kicked all the Jews out, the French kicked all the Jews out. Like, you have all these different instances throughout history where Jews have been terribly oppressed. And so now that, because Israel exists, and Israel exists within the context of effectively it's secular, but it is a right wing, in that it uses military force to protect its people, and is an ally of the American establishment, and particularly the American military establishment. You have radical professors who are communists, who basically create the Palestinian cause as the, kind of thing that then gets imported into the progressive side of the party. And you have someone like AOC, who I think has been tried to be a little bit more wily and careful, versus an Ilhan Omar or Rashida Tlaib, like, but realizing that, like, okay, from a progressive standpoint, I need to make sure that I am denouncing the DSA, the Democratic Socialist America protest pro support. Basically, it was support of Hamas. Like, there are videos of people basically justifying the attack this was in New York. So she's trying to kind of make sure that she's both sidesing it there, compared to someone like Richie Torres, who's her, I think, the next district over, right? And he is a congressman from New York, and he's been unapologetically supportive of Israel, and condemning Hamas and the Democratic Socialists of America and all this other kind of stuff. You have just a lot of people who are just throwing around opinions, and they can't even tell you, like, Sykes-Picot, Balfour Declaration, 48, 67, 73, like, basic facts. Like, could you actually play it out of, like, who attacked whom, and why does Israel have the West Bank and Gaza today, and the Golan Heights? Like, why do those borders exist? How far back are we going to justify who should have the land, right? Because prior to the Brits taking over after World War I, it was run by the Ottoman Empire for, since the 1500s, and they weren't particularly nice to the people there. It wasn't like a thriving area. And even in, like, 1830, Muhammad Ali of Egypt invaded Palestine, and ended up killing a bunch of people there. So it's Arab on Arab violence. So I think, like, you have very few people who actually have any context here, right? Like, they haven't done any reading beyond kind of like a surface level, or letting the New York Times beam down an opinion. So I just find it, like, the takes are just really bad most of the time. And then when people do have a little bit more nuance on the history, I think that they tend to be a little bit more like, okay, it's a messy situation, and it's an area of the world that has been conquered and traded between great powers since, the earliest time, right? Like the Assyrians, the Persians, like the Greeks, the Romans, the Byzantines, the Arabs, the Ottomans. Like, it's just like the Crusades. Like, it is just an area that has always been fought over, obviously because of the kind of, like, component to the kind of three main Abrahamic religions, but also just it's an area that has always been kind of rife with violence. And so I don't know. I think people kind of like they just have selective like, oh, I'm gonna only pull the history that like makes my point, but I actually don't want to have like any baseline for like why is this region something that people fight over all the time?
Hey, we'll continue our interview in a moment after a word from our sponsors.
Compliance doesn't have to be complicated. In fact, with Vanta, it can be super simple. Trusted by over 5,000 fast-growing companies like Chili Piper, Patch, Gusto, and Juniper, Vanta automates the pricey, time-consuming process of prepping for SOC 2, ISO 27701, HIPAA, and more. With Vanta, you can save up to 400 hours and 85% of costs. Vanta scales with your business, helping you successfully enter new markets, land bigger deals, and earn customer loyalty. And bonus, our Moment of Zen listeners get $1,000 off Vanta. Just go to vanta.com/zen. That's VANTA.com/ZEN.
If you're a startup founder or executive running a growing business, you know that as you scale, your systems break down and the cracks start to show. If this resonates with you, there are 3 numbers you need to know: 36,000, 25, and 1. 36,000. That's the number of businesses which have upgraded to NetSuite by Oracle. NetSuite is the #1 cloud financial system, streamline accounting, financial management, inventory, HR, and more. 25. NetSuite turns 25 this year. That's 25 years of helping businesses do more with less, close their books in days, not weeks, and drive down costs. 1, because your business is one of a kind, so you get a customized solution for all your KPIs in one efficient system with one source of truth. Manage risk, get reliable forecasts, and improve margins. Everything you need all in one place. Right now, download NetSuite's popular KPI checklist, designed to give you consistently excellent performance, absolutely free, at netsuite.com/zen. That's netsuite.com/zen to get your own KPI checklist. netsuite.com/zen. Yeah, a few comments. So first is on the Jew oppression. Jews and Asians particularly also break the leftist frame, which is these are groups of people who've been oppressed and yet flourished. And so the existence of them, what do they call it? The model minority myth or something? They're inconvenient minorities in the sense that if you look at them and their success, then you have to look at other groups and say, hey, why aren't you like Asians? Why aren't you like Jews? Right. And so they try to minimize that or say that's a different situation, et cetera. And you even have this with, we've talked about like immigrant Black people who come to this country, right? Like Nigerians or, whatever it is, come here and flourish or of other ethnic groups too. And so they try to sort of ignore these narratives because they're very inconvenient to the whole edifice of what's happening.
But let's just focus on why have Jewish people been so successful, like extraordinary level of success, given the percentage of the population and the unthinkable atrocity of the Holocaust, which killed 6 million out of I don't even know how many were at the time, 10 million, 12 million. So like massive percentage of the population. Yet they are resilient and continue to thrive. I don't know. Like I think like that's just a question people should ask themselves. And I think you get a lot of people who would then say, oh, well, they're white. Well, if you look at anything in the historical record, I can promise you that prior to the frame of race in America, no one was giving Jews any amount of credit in terms of like, oh, well, you're white, you're fine. They lived in ghettos and it was a very other in Europe, right? Like the reason you had so many in Eastern Europe was because it was actually relatively tolerant compared to Western Europe. And so you had a lot of Jews migrate into countries like Poland or Ukraine or places like that as a result of repressive Western European regimes, right? In England, in France, in Spain, against Jews. And so I just would push people to say, why has this group of people been so extraordinarily successful across everything that they do? I think it's culture. Like it is a culture of emphasis on the identity of being Jewish, but also like I think hard work, education. Nothing is going to be given to you in this world. If anything, it's actually going to be harder for you. Deal with it. I mean, and this is where Antonio would be nice to have, and obviously you're half Jewish, so I would be curious from your perspective. But I have so much admiration for that culture in the sense that it is a the world is a tough place culture, and I'm going to go get mine because no one is going to give it to me, and actually there are going to be people who are going to try to take it away from me because of who I am. And what an incredible mindset culturally of just saying, got to get through it. Life is tough. These are the cards I'm dealt with. That's how everyone should approach life, because life is tough. There is no one trying to give you anything.
One thing, just on one note, side note on Antonio, it looks like he may be going to Israel because the man can't resist a good war. He just texted us and was like, "Should we do MOZ from Israel?" I'm like, "Dude, we're recording right now." So we may have him for next episode, and if so, it's Israel episode.
I think he's like gonna definitely get his like Jewish credentials now, right? Like he's like returning to Israel. I'm gonna be curious what his take is. I mean, obviously he went to Ukraine.
The guy can't resist a good war. He's no bug man. He's ready to go. So on what makes Jews so successful? I mean, I think you cover education, culture. Maybe there's some natural selection, from just like being a constant pressure cooker. The idea that you know that life could end, or that your people are at risk. It sort of forces you to be on the top. You don't get lazy. You don't get complacent. You don't stop having kids, right? Israel has the highest fertility rate. So just that, like, it's natural, it's sort of evolutionary. You're in these tough conditions and you have to survive. You have to flourish. Jews as a group are highly insular. They help themselves. They focus on themselves. So they're, and often because they've had to, so they build each other up. And then there's probably an IQ component just on the group level on average that's just higher.
Careful, Erik, you're going to get canceled. My favorite Wikipedia, well, not my favorite, but it's a definitely top 25 Wikipedia article I've sent is Jewish Nobel laureates. Just look it up. Kind of interesting, right? Very small percentage of the population, yet an extraordinary group of humans that have pushed civilization forward, especially at a time when a lot of those breakthroughs are happening when Jews weren't considered white. How about that? So I think extraordinary group of humans. So that's where I start from. And so it's like, what's the opposite?
Yeah, philo-Semitism.
Yeah. But what's interesting about that term, by the way, anti-Semitic. So obviously Semitic is like the people in that region are all Semitic, right? Like I don't think it means Jewish. It's actually like it's a linguistic term, if anything, right? So it's like Arabic and Hebrew and Aramaic. I think are all within that branch. Like it's a distinct from Indo-European. How about that? I actually don't know if Arabic and Hebrew are the same, but I would imagine that it is. And so that's actually what I think is also, interesting about this is that there's just a lot of shared history, right? Like obviously Judaism, Christianity, and Islam are all kind of off of one kind of, Abraham, one founding myth. And obviously it is deviated quite a bit. That whole region prior to Christianity, and Antonio actually the one to point this out, there was no such thing as Judaism. Jews were a people, right, that had a religion, but in a world of a universalizing, and I'm going to try my best to do Antonio, in the universalizing theme of Christianity, where you can be Christian despite what people you're from, right? Like think about like how much Christianity spreads. It starts as like kind of this like cult within a bunch of Jews, moves to Greece and then to Rome, and then you have like pagan, Germanic tribes. Charlemagne is getting himself, crowned, but those people have nothing genetically, like for the most part, to do with the people who originated Christianity. So you have this religion that basically goes and conquers the world, and then you actually have a second Islam that does the same thing, right? It's like, yes, you have a lot of Arabs, but as we can see with Iran, like totally different group of people with Persians, and then you have all of the Muslims that end up in kind of like the in Indus River Valley area, like Pakistan, Malaysia, Indonesia. So, and then obviously in Africa. So you have two universalizing religions that come out of the same area, but both are kind of descendant of Judaism, and so I find that it's just fascinating. It's actually in some ways the reason the conflict is so intense is because there's actually enough overlap, at least from the kind of deep historical ties.
I actually want to do something even dicier, which is not just explain why Jews are so successful, but also explain or help, hypothesize on why they're disliked almost everywhere they go, or why there's all this anti-Semitism across populations, across time periods. And I'm certainly not going to be doing any victim blaming. I myself am Jewish and pro Israel, but Jewish friend asked me that, like, why are we so disliked? And I thought about it because I think it's actually a good question. If we're real intellectual, it's like worth thinking about. And I think it's like the flip side of every strength is a weakness. And I don't mean weakness in this case, but like objective envy, right? A group that's more successful than other groups, that sticks to themselves, helps each other out because they've had to over time. That group is going to arouse the envy of other groups. But I also think there's another thing that is worth noting, which is Jews love to argue. Jews love to start movements. Jews they're change agents, right? They are a source of new ideas, and that same thing leads to all these amazing innovations. It also leads to like all these different activist movements, right? Like the best capitalist supporters are Jewish. The best communism supporters are Jewish. The people who are like most pro-Israel are Jewish. The people even most pro-Palestinian are often Jewish. Like the people who are best at arguing for libertarian, like whatever, every movement are often Jewish. Jews just, they say 2 Jews, 7 political parties. And even before this, we talked about it with Liel and Ilana, like Israel somewhat had the kind of an intra-civil war, right? Like they love to argue. And so you have a group that comes into other populations and is more successful, is more insular, and also kind of starts shit for, activisty, perhaps, sometimes arouses not only the envy, but maybe the frustration of groups that kind of just want things to stay the way they were.
I think when you have a distinct culture of being an other, right? Like all of the kind of like hardcore, like you don't eat this type of food, no tattoos, you're wearing the hat, the sign of the covenant, which is circumcision. You have a whole bunch of stuff that is kind of distinguishing you. And it's not easy to join that tribe. You can, Antonio being an example of it, but like it is an other. And what's interesting is, I think if you look at the historical record, most populations of people, especially in the world of Christianity and Islam, they kind of just give up on their pre-universalizing religion, at least in the West, right? Like I don't think as much in like East Asia, but Southeast Asia for sure. You just have these dominant religious beliefs that kind of get attached to the empires that spread them, and then that is like definitely put into the culture. But Jews didn't do that, right? Like, so, you're willing to, Spanish Inquisition, you move to different places as a result of being expelled in kind of these, Catholic or Christian countries in Europe. And so I think the willingness to stick to the, like, what the identity is powerful, but obviously then makes you a target for kind of the power in a given area saying, hey, no, I want uniformity. Like everyone will convert to Christianity because this is useful for me in terms of being able to control people. And then I also think like you just have some historical quirks. So one thing, in a lot of medieval situations, you had a very hard time doing a lot of like early types of finance, especially lending. And so you naturally had non-Christian populations who, a lot of them were Jewish, would pick up some of these different kind of trades, and obviously you have examples of the Rothschilds, and then what is it, Jacob Fugger or whatever. There's a whole history there, but I think like the kind of success in the professions that they kind of ended up doing, plus the otherness, made them, I think, more of a target. And if I'm a enterprising politician who's looking to blame the troubles of a country on someone, easy to just point to the group that's doing well and as other, and actually then use that as a way to kind of sell the population on, hey, if we just solve this, then your life is going to get better, which obviously is a lie. Again, this goes back to the history point. Is I think just most people aren't very rooted in any amount of history. So their lens of history is kind of like a little bit of like what they learned in 8th grade American history, a little bit of world history. We have obviously this meme about the Roman Empire, but like, how often do you think about the Roman Empire? Like, okay, like let's actually break down the people who are claiming to think about the Roman Empire. And it's like, what is your level of knowledge of the Roman Empire on a scale of 1 to 10? And it's not to say you have to be a 10, but like I think most people, when they say they are interested in history, they're at a very surface level, and they just history is pretty boring if you actually want to go deeper. And I'm only saying this, all the reason is because who wants to read about the like nth Jewish expulsion or pogrom? Or it just, it's like, who cares about what medieval Poland cared about Jews? Like, most people don't actually want to go read that book. Like that's not as interesting as World War II or a biography on Leonardo da Vinci. Like, it's like a little bit more pop. Like, you're never going to see the like history of the Jewish people in the airport.
People don't even want to read the last 50 years of kind of Palestinian Israel negotiations and all the opportunities that there was opportunity for peace, but sort of Palestinian leadership took it off the table because they were too extremist about needing, they weren't willing to compromise or be seen as compromising to their people, so much to the point where now peace is impossible, or sort of the two-state solution, as it was possible a couple decades ago. It's possible there's these various agreements, for two-state opportunity for two-state solution. But my professor once said that Palestinian leadership has never missed an opportunity to miss an opportunity. And of course, Israel's made mistakes as well, but there's really no moral equivalence.
Did you just both sidesism?
All lives matter. I mean, in some sense, I actually, some people are saying, don't all lives matter? But I think all lives matter was actually always the right framing. I think, and in the sense of like, yeah, you condemn the violence, but also I think the steel man of what sort of people are thinking, and I'm obviously pro-Israel, but I think people are thinking, hey, 9/11 resulted in a massive counterattack disproportional to, we went to Afghanistan, we went to Iraq, we had Patriot Act, like all this stuff. And if you're calling this Israeli 9/11, like what's Israel about to do in response? And this, the steel man is that they don't want to give Israel the moral credibility in order to do that. And we should actually talk about the response. But I think that's where it comes from when people are both sidesing. And I don't agree with that, because I guess I do give Israel the right to do kind of what it plans to do. But I get that. I understand where they're coming from.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's worth, as unemotionally as possible, just like outlining what will probably happen. And, this is obviously amateur people on the sidelines. The kind of narrative that you're starting to see is Israel will end Hamas as a thing, right? So the kind of like weaselly thing that people try to do is, Hamas is a political party and was democratically elected. Okay, like maybe there's truth there in the sense that, like, yes, technically, but like I bet you if you could get the real honest opinions of people in Gaza, like, do they want to be run by a group that is willing to shoot off a bunch of rockets and kill innocent civilians to then only have innocent civilians in Gaza Palestinians get killed? I think that the average person probably would be like, that doesn't seem like a good trade-off. Maybe, and in that case, then if you support the method by which Hamas is going, arguably then you're as morally bankrupt as they are. Like that, like I don't think anyone can make an argument that an unprovoked attack on civilians on Shabbat, like in their homes, no military targets, right. So it'd be one thing if they had just gone and attacked the border bases and military bases. Still, like, you can pick your side, but the idea is that, okay, if combatants are fighting other military combatants, that is within a framework that you can actually say, okay, well, this is the side on both sides, and you can pick which one you want to believe in. But there is no version where you kill 260 people or 100 people at a kibbutz or children, or like no version of that. And then the person to quickly then say, well, the Israelis are killing Palestinians. The Israelis are killing Palestinians as collateral damage in trying to remove people who, to your point, have a mandate to eradicate Israel off the face of the earth. So if there was a political party in the United States that the whole goal was to eradicate a group of people in their mandate, I don't think people would be pretty okay with that, right? Like, so I think because it's far away, we're able to just kind of dilute the intensity of this mandate, and it's like not even stated actions, revealed actions now, right? And so I think Israel will eliminate Hamas. Like, One book that's really interesting, obviously, is going to be very infuriating if you're pro-Palestinian. But if you kind of want to read, it's from the Israeli perspective and a lot of sources from former Mossad people. A book called "Rise and Kill First," and so it's about the extrajudicial killing. That's what they call it, assassinations that Israel has done since 1948, and it just goes through the entire history. Obviously, Munich, like there was a whole set of those, including one really tragic death of someone who was not related to the killings, in famously in what I think Lillehammer in Norway. It goes through the whole program, right? So you start with actually Egypt, because people forget that Egypt was an actual power under Nasser and had a nuclear weapons program, and the Israelis first realized that that was an existential threat in an era when Egypt was involved, I think, in 48, 67, and 73. And if you don't even know, like when I'm referring to those years, what those wars are and what the outcomes were and kind of why, like you should probably push yourself to do a little bit more understanding, because hasn't been just like Israel picking on, the little kid at the schoolyard. For the most of Israel's history, Israel was not as strong as it is relative to these other Arab countries. It's only in the kind of last 30 years where Israel, thanks to frankly its technology industry, right? Like Israel is responsible for drones. Like the US didn't even have drones before Israel kind of really developed them for military purposes. And so now Israel is the big strong guy that might not even need US support if it really needed to. And but back in the post World War II, Nasser kind of leading Egypt had a weapons program, and he was hiring Germans, like German Nazi scientists, to try to build a bomb. And so Israel, that's where they first developed letter bombs and a whole bunch of things where they started killing Egyptian scientists. Then it gets into the section of the PLO, which again, if you don't know what the PLO is, not the Palestinian Authority, not Hamas, it's Yasser Arafat's organization, and the kind of things that the PLO was doing. You should probably get educated on that. And obviously the Israelis took the terrorist attacks from the PLO and obviously Munich, the Olympics attack, extremely seriously and effectively eliminated that organization, including in this book, they insinuate that they did kill Yasser Arafat. So the book is very detailed in terms of what it goes through. And then the more recent thing, outside of Hamas and Hezbollah, Israel, obviously the existential issue for Israel is Iran, right? So you have a big country. It's 90 million people, historically very powerful country in the grand arc of history, that is a theocracy that wants a nuclear bomb so that they can drop it on Tel Aviv and wipe out a huge percentage of Israelis in one shot. And so Israel has an existential problem with Iran, and you've had this flip-flopping of administrations in the U.S. to run everything through a domestic lens. So obviously Bush said Iran is in the axis of evil, along with Iraq and North Korea. And what's interesting is we went after Iraq. We don't necessarily get into that, and you can get as cynical as you want in terms of like what the actual rationale was. But there were no weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. And what it turns out is Iran is actually the one that's been making, a lot of progress. And so there's been a lot of effort to thwart, Iran's nuclear program. They claim it's to be civilian, but, they have a bunch of centrifuges. And if you don't understand how uranium enrichment works, that's also something you probably should Google on YouTube, because there's, you enrich uranium to about, I think, 20% for civilian use. When you get it up to 90%, you can use it in a bomb, or maybe a little higher. And you need to spin it around in centrifuges. So there's a famous, again, all this is kind of ripped out of like James Bond, but Stuxnet, which is insinuated to be an American-developed virus that the Israelis were the ones to bring the flash drive into the facility, which ended up, destroying, a ton of Iranian centrifuges for their uranium enrichment program. But what's interesting is you have Bush, axis of evil. Obama comes in. Obama basically wants to take the sanctions off of Iran. And he has this guy working in his administration his name's Robert Malley. And we talked about this a couple weeks ago with Jacob Siegel. But Turns out Robert Malley or people working for him are Iranian agents. And there was a story just before this in DC of like DC has been infiltrated by kind of like Iranian agents. And so Trump flipped the switch and said, no nuclear deal, Iran, I don't believe you. And if you mess with anything going on in Iraq, I'm going to have a hard line. The Iranians didn't believe him. They sent their kind of like most senior general Soleimani to Iraq to kind of be messing around with, Shia Sunni stuff there. And then Trump had a drone, blow up his car. And the Iranians didn't end up doing anything back. So kind of put them in their place. And then Biden comes in and Robert Malley is again in the administration and is now trying to give the Iranians money and lower the sanctions on them, which every time we do that, they go and take that money and you have all these people doing gymnastics to pretend that, oh, well, it's only for humanitarian things. $6 billion they don't have to spend on their population. They're going to go spend on proxy wars in Lebanon, in Gaza, in Yemen. Like, so I don't know.
Well, there's a few big questions we could tie it together. One is, does Israel move 2 million Gazans to somewhere else? Like, is that what's going to happen?
Who's going to take them? The revealed preference here. We support Gaza, but don't bring these Palestinians to my country, right? Like, they don't want them in Egypt. They don't want them in Jordan. Should those people have to go to those countries? No. But at the same time, like, for whatever set of circumstances, you are now having an enclave in Israel run by a genocidal terrorist organization that now has perpetrated an attack that's killed over 1,000 Israelis. Israel is going to just remove that. Like, this is the time to do it, and they're going to get rid of it.
The question is, what do they have to do to get rid of it?
Yeah, it's going to be a tragic, devastating thing. And I think one thing that's interesting is I've been following, a couple of more of these accounts just to kind of, I think Israel is doing a very good job on social media. Direct. So they're going direct. They have this guy who is a reservist. He, some colonel, and he's doing a daily update on what happens. And he's explaining what they're doing and, talking through. It's like, hey, we're warning everyone where we're going to go do our military attack, unlike Hamas did in terms of their surprise attack. This is what we're planning to do. We're sending leaflets. And obviously Hamas has, they're blocking the roads and telling people stay in your houses because they want to use people for human shields. But I mean, Israel, and they're putting out like TikToks of just like the terrible atrocities that are happening because they realize that they need to actually win the propaganda game because there's so much progressive media out there that is kind of trying to just basically say Israel's an apartheid.
And so the question there is, okay, what does Israel need to do to guarantee its security? Some people say that moving 2 million people out is ethnic cleansing, and it is to some degree, right? And that.
Well, hold on. Are moving 2 million people out versus killing 2 million people are very different things, right? Not desirable in either place. I don't think Israel wants to have to move people out. The reality is that the world is a tough place. And what is the better solution to get rid of Hamas? Like, you cannot have, if the Mexican cartels who ravage Mexico, if they came across the border and, well, there's kind of an irony here in that they kill 100,000 Americans a year with fentanyl, but that's a silent death. But if there is there a terrorist attack across the border in Texas and a bunch of different places, and there were 1,300 dead Americans.
Yeah, and if they were dedicated to the elimination of Americans and the taking back American land,
right? What would happen? What would happen?
We would do whatever it took.
So like just run it through a basic framework.
We would do whatever it took. I think Israel is saying, hey, if we don't sort of relocate these people, we either need to ethnically cleanse or be ethnically cleansed. Obviously, they would never put it in those positions because that term even includes an implication.
Right, but I think what they're going to do is, I mean, like, again, this is amateur thought, is they're just going to go block by block. They're going to clear out everything. They're going to get rid of every tunnel. And then they are not going to allow military-age males, for the most part, to come back in without. There's going to be an occupation, and they're going to clear out everything, and they're going to be a lot of. Well, I mean, it effectively is annexed. It's like, the country, they got all of their supplies from Israel. Like, Israel is able to cut off water and energy and all this other kind of stuff, which AOC was quick to point out. Right? It is going to be a tragic human situation. It is for everyone involved. Right? They're going to be dead Israeli hostages. They're going to be dead Israeli soldiers. They're going to be dead Palestinians. There's going to be dead Hamas. Like, there's going to be a lot of dead people, and that is. objectively and subjectively, extremely sad, right? So I think like, but going back to something that we've talked about, it's like I think the average American lives in this kind of post Cold War, nothing actually affects us. Everything can just kind of be, Twitter fingers. And the reality is there are places in the world where Twitter fingers turn to trigger fingers to, Drake. I still think it's a cheeky line, but it really, it's like, no, there are places in the world where like history has not ended. And what's crazy about Israel, because it's so tied into tech, is we know people who are getting called up into the military. Imagine just like in the US being called up as a reserve because we now need to go invade Mexico and remove the narco cartels, right? Like it is unfathomable. But that's the reality, that an Israeli person who could be working on, I don't know, some AI app in an SF, and it's like they got to get on a flight back to Israel because their country is at war. Like that is a very different version of the world than the PM seer on the coast who's like worried about where they're, skiing over Martin Luther King Day weekend.
And so, if you had to guess where the refugees end up, to the extent that there are refugees,
I think they'll just be in Gaza. I think obviously there will be some people who leave, but I don't think that they are going to clear out Gaza permanently. I think that they are going to eradicate Hamas and then have it be under a significant amount of occupation or new set of rules. Hard to imagine what it will be, but there will be no infrastructure left for Hamas when Israel is done with Gaza. And I don't think Israel cares.
You think they can eradicate Hamas but leave a million Gazans or a million Palestinians?
I think it's going to be very difficult to be a military age male or plus or minus, a couple years to in Gaza. I think that will be. I don't even want to speculate in the sense that I think it is going to be a terrible, terrible human tragedy. But Israel has every right to remove a genocidal terrorist organization that has inflicted
and swords to kill it. Yeah.
Yeah. So that is going to be. And look, I mean, the West Bank is run by the Palestinian Authority. There are issues in the West Bank, but at the same time, it is not nearly the same degree as Hamas.
Our good friend Noah Smith, he's got some great takes. He's got some takes we disagree with. I have a podcast with him, Econ 102, that is great. He says, this is a take I disagree with him on. He says we should double the GDP of Gazans, and that would make them fat and happy, or in the same way that every country gets rich.
How do you double the GDP?
Invest in Gaza growth, etc.
I mean, did he bring this up? Israel had been allowing 20,000, 30,000 Gazans a day to go to into Israel. Sounds like a lot like NAFTA in the sense of like, yes, not as still a pretty hostile relationship prior to this atrocity, but a Gazan, Palestinian from Gaza going into Israel and earning a wage in Israel at whatever job they're digging, and then being able to bring that hard currency back to this extremely poor area. That was on a path to that, and Hamas decided that wasn't good enough. They decided that the action that they wanted to take is to lash out, which obviously, if you think about it from a kind of like the classic frame of a terrorist, is they want to provoke an overreaction. But I think in this case, they may have crossed too far, right? So it's like a terrible to be able to try to justify, but if you change the order of magnitude, maybe you don't get the same response. But I think once you cross the what happened and how it happened, and in an age of social media, I think they miscalculated on the resolve that is now going to happen from Israel. And I could be wrong, right? Like we could get 2 weeks into this, and the Borg of the globalist international politics sees these terrible images coming out of Gaza, and they're like too much. But at the same time, what are they going to do? Like, what are they going to sanction Israel? Because the reality is, the only country that matters in terms of dictating a little bit more of how Israel's thinking about stuff is the U.S. And we just moved the carrier battle group to the Middle East, and Biden's an establishment Democrat, and I don't know how he got it past those progressives. So something's still in that brain, in terms of he's not completely gone, but that is we now have a president who's committed, And wherever way it goes in 24, unless Biden somehow doesn't make it, and we have, Kamala or Gavin Newsom or someone somehow make it. But even there, I would imagine Gavin Newsom probably would be more establishment. So outside of a crazy progressive who makes it to the White House and changes the policy, you're either going to have Biden, who seems to be pretty supportive of Israel's right to defend itself, or you get someone who's even more aggressive, especially towards Iran.
Well, just to finish the Noah Smith point, or why I disagree with it, many people, once they get richer, stop caring about ethnic tribal conflict that's lasted 1,000 years. But many people, but there are certain, Bin Laden was rich. He was not poor. Like, some of these terrorists, they're not poor. They're actually quite wealthy, and they will use the money that they get to destroy, the object that they're targeting. And it's tough for people like Lex Fridman, or people who are high IQ, people who are believe in peace and love and were educated in this, to believe that there are people who've been brainwashed their whole lives to hate a certain group of people. And so they want to extend sort of the liberal Enlightenment, values to a global population when that is not the norm. And especially in this region, there's been so much violence for so long and so much brainwashing that simply making these people richer is not going to let them hate us. This is not just a one-off conflict. This is a
I'd push back on that. Like, I think it's a dangerous. Like, I understand where, like, the kind of argument, but I think it's a dangerous thing to just kind of like blanket a group of people and say, like, like everyone is, brainwashed by Hamas or whatever. No.
Right, but Noah was blanketing in the other direction, right? Like, you need to make a generalization. Yeah.
No. So here's how you split it. If you systematically eradicate Hamas over whatever the next few months, year, multiple, you don't just have a new Hamas spring up. I think it will take time. Something will replace it at some point. And don't forget, there's also like Palestinian Islamic Jihad, which is another organization that Iran. You have Hezbollah in Lebanon. You have all the Iranian-backed militias in Syria. So it's not like Israel is getting rid of all of its kind of like existential enemies. But in terms of this specific enemy, Israel, it seems like, is going to eradicate it. It will get rid of it completely. And what you will have is a shell form of whatever it is. In the same way, though, that and this is what I would flip to my other side of like arguing against myself is that's like saying, okay, we'll get rid of the cartels. So you get Chapo and you put him in jail, and what do you actually get? You get more violence, and you get even more aggressive cartels because there's a modulating influence on having a strong, powerful person that you can at least control. Yeah. So maybe that happens. I think it just gets hard because you get rid of all the infrastructure. You permanently get rid of the tunnels. Like you basically say, hey, we're gonna occupy Gaza, like, permanently, and we're gonna go block by block and remove every weapon, just get rid of everything, and it's gonna have a huge cost on Israeli soldiers as well. But you get to a point where you really lock it down, and it just is so much harder than what it is today, which is obviously there's plenty of rockets, and although they're making rockets from the water pipes. So it's like people are like, oh, there's no water in Gaza. It's like, yeah, it's because Hamas uses the water pipes to make rockets. But they're gonna remove all of those, the status quo tactics, and you'll get new ones. People will still hate Israel, and they will figure out ways to do stuff. But do we worry about Al Qaeda today? Despite the 20 years in Afghanistan and the failed war in Iraq and ISIS and all that kind of stuff, the reality is the kind of like, radical Islamic terrorism is not a major issue in the United States today, and frankly has not. We've had a couple of small incidents, but we've systematically destroyed the existing infrastructure, and then we created it with ISIS, but I think have since been able to bring it way back. I don't think you ever get rid of it, right? Like it is a simmering fire that will get new blood on it, and people will want to do it. But
let's address the Sachs position, right? Because Sachs is being intellectually consistent here when he says, hey, we shouldn't have gotten involved in Ukraine, or involved to the extent that we did. We made things worse. We risked potentially a global war. And he's saying the same thing here. He's saying, escalation is unlikely to lead to peace. And we shouldn't be facilitating or sort of encouraging a strong counter because of the risk of getting a global war. feel free to add anything to this position, but why do you disagree?
Yeah, so I think the one difference is that, so one, the U.S. hasn't gotten involved yet. So he's kind of preemptively saying, like, yeah, we put the battle group in the Eastern Mediterranean. I think that there was some stuff that we've kind of indicated to the Israelis, we may shoot down a rocket from Hezbollah to just say, hey, right. And so for those who don't know, Lebanon is a failed state run by a terrorist organization, Hezbollah, which is funded by the Iranians. And they have even more rockets than, because it's like an actual country, right? And again, not the Lebanese people, but the fact that it's run by Hezbollah, I think also democratically elected. But they have even more weapons pointed at Israel. I think the challenge there is they might be fat and happy in the sense that, like, hey, maybe I don't, because Gaza's this like little thing. It's like 9 miles, 20 miles by 9, right? So it's not very big. I mean, Lebanon is like a real size country, but I think where the U.S. getting involved in that starts to actually be like, okay, I could actually start to have an argument, be like, let's support Israel if that's our position, but I don't think we should have any American boots on the ground for sure. But then you get into okay, if we have some drones that are basically shooting down rockets to just kind of indicate, or stuff that we've been doing in Syria, it gets a little harder to say, like, is that a huge commitment? I think Sachs is very principled in the sense that he does not want any foreign wars. And I generally am sympathetic to that. I actually think it's like the U.S. should just back out and let the rest of the world kind of deal with the problems, and then the U.S. can be selective in who we are allies with, and we should actually benefit from those alliances versus a kind of like post World War II Bretton Woods. We basically run global security for everyone, and everyone else gets to benefit off that. Because I just don't see anyone challenging us in any way. I mean, like, I think the China stuff is overblown personally, but going back to that, Iran is different than Russia. Russia has nuclear weapons. The Lindy factor here is they haven't used them. Okay, so they seem to have, and say what you want about Putin, but he is a creature of the Cold War, and I think that the doctrine of mutually assured destruction, you can argue all you want, but it's held up, right? And maybe this is a fallacious argument in the sense that, like, it holds up until it doesn't. But I think, like, if you assume rational actors on the other side, they won't use the nuclear weapons. I don't know if I could say the same thing about Iran, given that their actual supreme leader is tweeting out the destruction of Israel is our goal. And Israel specifically as a country, you drop a nuke in Tel Aviv, or you smuggle a nuke into Tel Aviv and you have it go off. That would be such a devastating, just given how small the country is and how concentrated. Or if you did it in Tel Aviv and Jerusalem, I mean, that is an existential threat to the state of Israel. And so, to the degree that you believe that Israel existing is good for the world, good for American politics, or American foreign policy, then actually making sure that Iran is contained, which is just so crazy that Obama and then Biden have taken this kid glove approach to Iran of like, oh yeah, we'll trust you that you're not going to go turn around and continue to try to enrich uranium. So that's where I would push back a little bit, Sachs, in the sense that, put another way, if the Iranians get a bomb, do you believe that they would actually be willing to use it? More so than most countries or all the other countries who have the bomb today. And I think you can go through the list, right? It's like US, France, UK, Israel has never disclosed it, but people assume that they have it. Russia, India, Pakistan, and then North Korea. And then South Korea and Japan are like a wrench turn away. That's like the actual term. So it's like, those are your people who have bombs. I think Brazil has had a program in the past. South Africa had a program. Egypt obviously had one. But Iran getting a bomb in the Middle East would be a major, major problem in terms of both for Israel, but also then the Saudis are going to want to bomb, right? Like, don't forget, like, Iran and the Saudis like hate each other. Shia Sunni, like, this like warming of relations that obviously I think is going out the door, even though the Abraham Accords are not going to work out right
well
now.
Yeah, to that point, I mean, worth mentioning a bit how perhaps it seems like the goal of this sort of attack that was perhaps funded by Iran or supported by Iran was to dismantle the Saudi Israel alliance, which it looks like it has, at least short term. What if Israel said, hey, we don't just want to eliminate Hamas, we want to eliminate the sort of chance of Iran continuing to cause damage in the region or put Israel's security at risk? What would the more aggressive move look like? Does ending Hamas really prevent Iran from funding some other group, from the other groups that are sworn to eliminate Israel? Like, what is sort of, if you're Israel right now and you're trying to guarantee sort of security for the future, what's your move here?
Well, I mean, obviously getting rid of Hamas. So Israel's got multiple borders that have extremely hostile people on it, right? So you have Hamas in the south, which just perpetrated, funded by Iran. So they're going to get rid of Hamas. So then you don't have any issue on the south, right? Because the rest of the south is the Sinai Desert and Jordan, Saudi Arabia, kind of right there. Okay, so Jordan is a kind of peaceful relative to Israel, U.S. and Egypt, the same in terms of like the U.S. has kind of locked down those alliances. In the north, you have Lebanon, Hezbollah, and then Syria with the Golan Heights. Okay, Syria is a failed state. You have roving militias and all these other kind of things. I don't think that is the bigger issue right now, especially also just from a geographic standpoint. Like Israel is on the top of mountains looking into Syria. Like it is very difficult for anything bad to happen to Syria. However, Lebanon, like there was a Lebanon war, a decade plus ago, and with Israel, and again, way more rockets. Hezbollah is a lot more sophisticated than Hamas. So I think that is the next problem for Israel to think about. But in a world where they don't have Hamas in their south, then you don't have to have as much resources pointed there, right? Like you will have some, but then the focus can kind of be on the north. If Israel was to take action against Iran, then you're going to have Hezbollah and stuff in Syria both tried. So now you're going to be fighting like not even just the three fronts directly on your country, but having anything else that Iran is trying to do. Jews all over the world are going to be targeted. Like that's a big step for them. But one interesting thing is, again, going back to history, the Israelis bombed Saddam Hussein's nuclear reactor. So I think it's like early 80s. They did a mission and they just blew up the reactor. You can just like type like Israel, Iraq, nuclear reactor. And so they have precedent and having done this. Bibi, last few years was saying that they were going to kind of take action. And obviously there's been tons of assassinations that have happened in the Iranian nuclear program, like very ripped out of a movie, like in terms of like motorcycle, the guy's driving to work. He's the kind of chief nuclear scientist and some motorcycle, two people on a motorcycle and it's like with an Uzi and they just shoot up the car. There was a really crazy one where it was like a car that had like a mechanical turret that like blew up a guy. And so they've been systematically removing a lot of the like talent in terms of like the ability to make progress on the bomb. But yeah, I mean, if anything, this may now say to Israel, it's like, okay, we have to, like, we can't play within this globalist, like secular, we're going to work as kind of like getting to a place of peace with these different groups. This is existential. And if this is what Hamas with the least amount of capabilities is willing to do, like we may need to actually solve Hezbollah permanently, solve Syria permanently. And that's not putting occupation in those countries as much as systematically removing their ability to do things and then actually try to do the same in Iran. But this is actually where I think it's important for Israel, and I think that they appreciate that, is having the U.S.'s support keeps Iran from getting too meddled, especially overtly, right? Like I think that they're going to always be doing stuff covertly and through proxies. But if the U.S. is willing to say, hey, no one else mess in this, this is Israel's operation in Gaza, and we have a carrier battle group here or a couple, and we're saying this is how it's going to go, I don't think you get anything too crazy from the Iranians. And then I actually here's my thing. I don't actually believe that the Saudis are totally off the board in the sense that I think MBS, there's a lot you can say about MBS, but I think MBS is a modern ruler for Saudi Arabia relative to what Saudi Arabia has been led by in the past. Yes, his father is kind of old, senile, and from the hardline old camp of like, pan-Arabism and like, pro-Palestinian. But I think MBS looks at this situation and goes, I want a closer relationship with Israel because I actually believe Israel is not an existential threat. The Palestinians are more of an annoyance to me if I think about I'd rather have a strong relationship with Israel against Iran. Maybe it's on ice for a few years, but like Israel didn't do anything against the Arabs. It is a more of a political situation where they have to kind of say, hey, look, we don't support any violence against Arabs. But the reality is 1,300 dead Israeli civilians is a terrible atrocity. And I think I wouldn't be surprised if Israel continues to make progress, especially if you get a second Trump administration, which I don't think people appreciate how much those chances are increasing all the time. And I think maybe to close, like there's that very popular tech podcast.
All in.
There were 3 endorsements of the Trump
I was
administration
amazed at how much the culture has shifted. Yeah.
from people who've been accused and probably have TDS.
Not had something great.
So I think like if that's a bellwether, like I think you are going to find people more and more in a world where Russia, Ukraine, Iran meddling with Israel and stuff like that, China, and you're going to be surprised that he's going to be doing as well in the polling going into the election, and probably still a coin flip. Like there are a lot of people who don't like him, but the border, I think if you have people starting to look at Trump and say, oh, ignore the messenger, but look at the message, that's a shift in the Overton window. And I think people should just be mentally prepared that you're going to start to hear a lot more of that. And I think now is an interesting thing of like this split in the kind of like Democratic Party of people who are pro-Israel and people who are pro-Palestine. Those pro-Israel Democrats, if they don't like the direction that whether the Biden is talking on the campaign trail or you get a more progressive presidential candidate somehow, they could be voting in the privacy of the voting booth for Trump. So
I listened to a few hours of Jared Kushner on Lex Fridman's podcast talking about the situation. And I never heard Jared speak before. And only the words that I had associated with Jared were the words that I heard from the media, the sort of emotional loading. And what did I hear? I heard he was corrupt. I heard he was naive, didn't know anything about what was going on, just there because of nepotism, not a great person. These are kind of the emotional loading that the media, the listeners here probably have or had of Jared Kushner. But you listen to him for 3 hours, 4 hours, and he's actually incredibly thoughtful and incredibly smart. And it kind of changed my perception of him. And it's a little bit of Gelman amnesia, like what else were they, sort of exaggerating or making not seem true. He actually has an excellent grasp of what's happening in the region, and it sounds like did really great work to move things forward. And it isn't, we can't run the counterfactual of would this have happened if Trump was still president? But yeah, it'll be interesting to see.
I would even admit I had this opinion, I think largely because of how the mainstream media had covered, but like I hadn't actually done any work to update my priors. And so one, I just had this assumption that he got into Harvard because his dad is like pretty famous, like donated a bunch of money, whose dad went to federal prison from Chris Christie. So there's like some history there. And one of the reasons I think Christie didn't, he ran the transition, but then Kushner kind of knifed him in the back as like an FU, from my dad. I have a long memory. I think the second thing I was like, okay, so nepotistic way of getting into Harvard. He had owned the the New York Observer, kind of like this like socialite in New York, obviously, ran in the same circles as Trump type thing. And then obviously when you hear like, oh, your son-in-law is now a senior advisor in a PMC driven, we only pick the best people, merit based people. I kind of, and actually, to be fair, I think a part of this was also colored by Hillary Clinton was actually the first nepotistic presidential thing. And for people who don't know, Hillary Clinton was in charge of the healthcare plan, right? It was Hillary Care. And that was actually part of the basis of like people starting to really hate her on the right. And but the fact that she was running an important initiative within the Clinton White House and people felt like she hadn't been elected. So the right was the first one to really go after someone like that. And then I think the left, obviously, with Kushner. And so I think I was just kind of in my mind, I'm like, okay, it's this, Vanka's husband and Trump is Trump. And so I think listening to that podcast, you realize that there is a level of competence that I was unaware of. And so I feel ashamed that I hadn't done any work there prior. And the thing I would challenge anyone is just listen to the podcast and ignore that his name is Jared Kushner and he worked for Donald Trump. Like, just imagine you were swapping that in for Obama. And it just like the same set of things that he's saying, and the policies and strategy to try to normalize relations between two groups that basically for 75 years wouldn't talk to each other. I think, yeah, it's just like it's a humbling experience if you come in with preconceived notions. And then to your point, it's like, what other prior should you be trying to update? Like, I think people should just be like preparing themselves. Like the Overton window is shifting on Trump in that now, because Biden is doing things that Trump kind of had said, you're going to get more centrist people who kind of are like, yeah, he's annoying, but from a governance standpoint, there was actually a lot of stuff that he was doing that was right. And I think it's going to just drive people crazy because the progressive left is going to go even harder against that. And actually it's a purity test. So it's going to even be more cancellations of people for trying to do that. But voting booth is private. So we will find out. And I think that these cases don't seem like they're going to have legs. I think if anything, it's just going to add more to his like martyr status. So I think people should be prepared that he is ascendant right now. Whether or not that's enough to win the election, you won't know until the day of or the day, a couple weeks before if it feels like it's tracking. But like none of the other Republicans. I mean, we've talked about this in the past. Like, how's that Vivek prediction working out? Right? It's like Nikki Haley is the new one. I think it's like it's Trump Biden unless Biden or Trump doesn't make it.
And it'd be interesting to see how long how long the Israel situation lasts. Is this something that Israel responds swiftly and then it's done? Or is this something that 6 months from now, we're still...
You know this stuff. It's like nothing is a short war, right? It's like World War I was supposed to be a short, like everything's supposed to be a short war, and it just drags on. Whether it's 20 years in Afghanistan, I mean, obviously you could argue that like the entire Palestinian question is 70-year occupation, if you want to use it from that frame. But the other interesting thing is just like these wars are playing out on social media, and like literally both sides are knowing that is actually the way to push their message. And so there's just a lot of information flying around. Obviously now that with AI and just being able to reuse old footage and then just kind of put something in a viral tweet, like I hate the term misinformation because it assumes that there is a right version of the truth. And it's like anyone who kind of like has any sense for history is like, of course, there's always multiple sides of things. But, and everyone's talked about this, like the fact that Elon is running X means that there is not going to be some truth commission in San Francisco who probably would be more sympathetic to the Palestinian side of things that is like putting its finger on the scales as to what gets amplified versus not. I think you really, to use the arena term, it's just like pure arena. Like it is just like, what is the algo going to reward? And I think that is an important part of this kind of like modern warfare, right? It's like winning the hearts and minds or keeping it relevant with people in the US who obviously are going to impact the presidential election, which will impact, Israel's.
Well, it's possible that some of those people in that group or in that circle would be Jewish, so it's possible they support Israel. But either way, I do appreciate, as you mentioned, not putting the thumb on the scale. I want to wrap with just a couple sort of pointer disclaimers. Yeah, obviously, we're sort of amateur analysts or historians.
Wait, let me just push on that though. I think like if you're listening to this podcast and like what you want is experts, like I'm promising you, most experts are full of shit or they have an agenda, and so it's like what we're trying to do is just reason about information that's coming into us and share our takes. And this is an entertainment podcast. This is not meant to be any official take. It's just like two people's thoughts and trying to consume the information the same way that you are.
I would be interested in talking to someone who disagrees with us a bit more. You know, we tend to be more on the Israel side of the argument in terms of perspective, but I would love to have Amjad or someone like Amjad, intellectual caliber, who has a slightly different position. He would never do it because, there's too much. It's too controversial of a topic, and he's CEO of Replit and needs to focus on that. But someone truly brilliant, first principles thinker who's got some different perspectives, I'd welcome that on this show.
I'm just going to say probably me. I'm not going to want to have that conversation. And it's not shying away from it. It's just I actually don't think there's a ton of upside. And maybe the listeners would be like, yeah, we should do that. But I think what that conversation is going to be is a bunch of citations and examples that will be like, this is why this has been bad, and this is contextualizing it. And I will agree with those examples, assuming I can go verify on Wikipedia. But then I'm going to come from the place of, okay, so what do you actually want done? The reality is power is the thing that matters. There is no referee. The UN can't just like be like, oh, here's the ruling. Okay. Like everyone gets their side and no, it's just like Israel is in control, and that's where we are. And so the best thing that we can do is get to a place where, Israel is willing to kind of like work with whatever group. And so that's, I would be open to it in the sense that I would allow like another person to be able to voice like, hey, here's a different point of view. And so maybe that's valuable in its own right. But I don't think it would be as much of a discussion, because I think it's just like you're coming from a place of like, I think that this is right. And the right doesn't matter. Like what matters is, can it actually happen? Right. This is the same thing with healthcare in the United States. It's just like, who cares about like who is right? It's like tactics. Like, how does this mechanically change? And so that would be my only push. And so if we want to have that conversation, I'm fine to have that person come on. But I'm skeptical that we would actually make any progress outside of just a bunch of people citing stats that you'd have to go look up on Wikipedia to say, okay, yeah, there have been some dead people on one side and dead people on the other side.
I think this is going to be the biggest sort of culture war in some time, because it's so complicated, because there's strong people on both sides. And I hope people don't lose too many friends over it, or too many jobs, or, I guess I do take the hot take that all lives matter. This is an absolute tragedy, that you can condemn violence on one hand. And I do think Israel should guarantee its security, but I also, I despair at the lives that are going to be lost. I hope civilians are minimized as much as possible. I hope these other countries open up their sort of immigration policy to take people in if that's what's needed. And I think it's okay to want both of those things. And I think it was okay 3 years ago too.
Let me respond that last one. I actually don't think most people are going to lose friends from it. Some, of course. I don't think the PMC is pro Hamas. It is just enough both sidesism. It's go look at Barack Obama's tweet. That is the position that the average PMCer, who I think that the reality is that's probably a lot of who listens to this podcast. And so that's all you have to kind of do, and then you can kind of move on. You will have the radical progressives who are doubling down on, pro Hamas, or the kind of like Palestinian cause is the only just cause. But I actually like, if the BLM Chicago thing is any indication, I think that the response there is going to be quick to be like, okay, you know what, we're gonna just avoid this one, because this is going to hurt our long-term ability to attract over the kind of like good liberal. I basically am saying I disagree. I do not think that this will be as big of a culture war issue, primarily because of the scale of the atrocity that had.
But wait until Israel counters, right?
But they're not going to do anything. I mean, they could, but I highly doubt they are going to do anything at the scale and shock impact. There probably will be some terrible thing, like a bomb goes off and it, in the wrong target, and it kills a bunch of kids in a shelter, and it'll be a super big tragedy, right? But there is no version of indiscriminate killing of 260, like slaughtering people at a music festival, or burning babies, or like, for like deliberate purposes, right? So I think most reasonable people are going to be able to separate, like, it's tragedy, yes, period. But the tragedy that comes as a result of war versus the tragedy that comes as a result of a terrorist attack. And I actually, maybe I'm too optimistic, but I really think that the center establishment of the Democratic Party is very much in the pro-Israel camp, even if they have to kind of do that lightweight both sidesism. But when Barack Obama and Biden are basically in the pro-Israel camp, I think it's very hard for the progressives to kind of like really seize the issue. And here's the thing. If we had a Republican president right now, I actually think you may see more people tack to the progressive side just as a reflexive, like, oh, this is like a good wedge issue. But the reality is the person who's supporting the Israelis is Biden. So if anything, like if that disillusions some people to want to vote for Biden or like support Biden, and I don't believe this because I actually think people hate Trump so much that if it's Trump versus Biden, they're going to vote for Biden no matter what. But any loss of enthusiasm for Biden is a benefit to Trump or the Republicans.
Let's we will find out. Let's wrap on that. This is a great one, Dan. To be continued. Turpentine is a network of podcasts, newsletters, and more covering tech, business, and culture, all from the perspective of industry insiders and experts. We're the network behind the show you're listening to right now. At Turpentine, we're building the first media outlet for tech people by tech people. We have a slate of hit shows across a range of topics and industries, from AI with Cognitive Revolution to Econ 102 with Noah Smith. Our other shows drive the conversation in tech with the most interesting thinkers, founders, and investors, like Moment of Zen and my show Upstream. We're looking for industry-leading hosts and shows, along with sponsors. If you think that might be you or your company, email me at erik@turpentine.co. That's ERIK@turpentine.co.